it is. Flip it. Let's move.
Hi, welcome to Dead Principles. Years ago, when I was still in school, I read a very interesting article about the meaning of words. Because in the social sciences, very often in academic papers, a person will, at the very top, provide a list of definitions of different terms that they're going to be using throughout the course of the article. And the reason why they do that is because they need the reader to understand that in the context of the article they're writing, a specific word has a specific meaning. And if they don't clearly define that, then a person might misinterpret the meaning of the word, and that results in a loss of clarity. And so throughout the social sciences, because it's not like the hard sciences where you're just using a formula and the formula has this result and there's no debate about that. There's only one conclusion that can be drawn from what's presented. Whereas in the social sciences, the soft sciences, where it's less qualitative and less quantitative, more qualitative, there's room for interpretation, and that leads to a lack of precision, and that lack of precision can be problematic. So, in order to avoid that, a person will provide the definitions within the text so that anyone reading it, if there's any confusion, they can refer to that specific definition and say, okay, in this context, that's what this word means. I understand what's going on. Great. It's a practical solution to a constant problem. In law, it's the very same way. So, for example, if there's a contract, within the contract, if there's any concern about doubt, they will very clearly define in the context of this contract, this word means this. It's the same with treaties. What do we mean when we say borders? And then they very clearly define that term so that there's no misunderstandings. So this is a useful solution to an ever-present problem. However, it creates another problem, which is that words can be defined and redefined so many different ways, so many different times, that the end result is you have words that mean way too much and are used way too often and cover way too much ground, which means that the overarching dilemma is that within the social sciences, it's more difficult to understand what words mean. You can run into the same problem in law. So I read a very interesting article that was discussing the need to rein in this constant use of similar words in many different ways, because overall it means, like, for example, in a context of meta-analysis, this creates a lot of problems, because you can't just say, look for this word in all these different articles, and then we can extract, consistent meaning out of it, because that's not true, because one word is used in so many different ways. So, and the reason I'm talking about this is because when it comes to things like the truth, what does that mean? Because right now, we have a lot of different people saying they're telling the truth, but they're all saying different things. And this is becoming a big problem in society generally. So, for example, the death of the woman in Minnesota, was that a justified defensive measure, or was it murder? Depending on who you ask, it's one or the other, or somewhere in between those two. And everybody claims to be telling the truth. You have public officials saying they're telling the truth, but those public officials are conflicting with one another. People at the state level, are saying one thing. Federal officials are saying something completely different, and everybody says they're telling the truth. In this particular instance, we at the very least have the benefit of being able to see what happened with our own eyes. There was enough video present of what occurred start to finish that any person can look at that themselves and draw their own conclusions, which I think is why, in particular, the federal government, because they're on their heels with this one, they have to be defensive because it was their action that seems to be objectionable. So they're fighting very hard to try to control the narrative and claim that it was justified, that there were clear and present dangers. But I don't know, my eyes didn't see that. My eyes saw someone trying to get away from people that were storming her vehicle, and then she was killed for that. I didn't see a threat to any of those officers. I saw the only danger those ICE agents were put in was the danger they placed themselves in, because they're the ones trying to get in front of a car that's trying to move away. And since the shooter didn't so much as have a broken toe out of the whole thing, there was no immediate danger to him. And how could there be? The car was moving far too slow. But anyway, I'm sure it's going to continue to be debated for as long as there's disagreement, which seems like that's going to continue for a while. But the problem is that there's not universal truth right now in our society, and that lack of universal truth leads to questions about reality. What is reality? What are the constituent components that make up reality? Because truth is the foundation of reality. We look at what is true, and based on what is true, we understand reality more generally. So if a person driving slowly in a car away from a federal agent now constitutes a threat, well, that's a change in reality. And it goes against a lot of what previous reality said, including Supreme Court rulings. So, this attempt to shift reality is a fundamental problem for our society, for any society around the world at this point, because to a greater or lesser degree, every government seems to be attempting things like this. Obviously, Russia has been playing with their citizens' perception of reality for a very long time. China also. Really, any sort of more dictatory type governments try to do that because inherently no citizen enjoys a dictatorship because they have very few freedoms and people enjoy freedom. That's why democracies tend to be a lot more popular because the people in those societies have greater freedoms. They can exercise their own individual will to a greater degree. They can express themselves freely. They can pursue their own interests freely, and they don't have to worry about that coming in conflict with the government or any authorities. Unfortunately, the United States is very clearly moving into a direction of fewer and fewer freedoms and greater restrictions on people's personal behavior. That's why they're trying to crack down on any form of protest because they don't want free expression. And this is happening nationally, but also on state levels. There's lots of public officials on the state level that are trying to quash any kind of dissent, any kind of speech that would draw attention to their inappropriate actions or their attempts to stifle freedom of information is a very big one. And so this problem of not knowing what words mean becomes a problem more generally speaking, because it's not just limited to academia at this point, it's everyday life. You know, what does it mean to be a threat to federal agents, for example, at this point? What does that mean? Because apparently now it means trying to drive away from them, you're threatening them, even if you're unarmed, because now your car is designated as a weapon in all cases, whether you're driving a car towards someone. Okay, that makes sense as a threat. Driving away from them, how is their car being weaponized in that scenario? That doesn't make any sense. And since virtually everyone has a car, because you have to have a car in the United States because public transportation in the majority of this country is terrible. So if you want to have a functioning life, you really need a car. So are they now suggesting that virtually the entire population of the United States is armed because they have a car and cars are now designated as weapons? See, it's a very slippery slope of every time they suggest some new thing is to be identified in some new and different way. they create the circumstances necessary for them to impose their will on the public more aggressively. And this is very dangerous to us, to the public. It's not dangerous to the federal agents because they keep getting permission to do more and more and face less and less, fewer and fewer consequences for that. This idea that every federal agent has immunity from everything, that's not true. That's not written into any law anywhere. At this point, the only person who has, you know, carte blanche immunity from everything, as far as I can tell, is the president. And that was obviously a horrible mistake. And the Supreme Court knew that what they were doing was wrong, which was why the dissent in that decision was very clear. And the only, I mean, Chief Justice Roberts made it clear before Trump was elected that it was time to pick a side, and he had done so. So there's clearly a drive to give the federal government as many powers as they can as quickly as possible because they want, a Republican takeover of the country. And this is something that doesn't actually make a lot of sense because the only time Republicans win is when there's lower turnout. Whenever there's a big turnout for election, Democrats win because of course they do, because Democrats are endorsing the things that people want and need more. It's the Republicans that want to take away all of the social services. Always. They want to give more tax breaks to the rich and they want to stop giving money to the poor because, I don't know, they just don't like the poor, I guess. But in a society where we are getting poorer and poorer each and every day, that becomes a real problem. And, Trump and the Republicans are desperately trying to pretend that they care about our healthcare and that they care about the cost of living and they want to keep taxes down for us, except they don't do that. If you ignore their words and look at their actions, they give tax breaks to the rich. They do believe in subsidies, but only for the rich. Elon Musk has gotten more tax dollars than I think any other billionaire at this point, although I can't say that for certain because there's so little transparency in those transactions. So again, what do words mean at this point? If the government says, well, we don't want to give handouts to anybody, but they do want to give handouts. They want to give handouts to the rich. They just don't want to give handouts to the poor, which is why Trump has already said that they're going to compensate the oil companies for what they're doing in Venezuela, which is why he's promised all this money to AI firms. Which definitely he will bail out when they collapse because they have a broken business model. So again, the meaning of words matters. And currently, there does not seem to be any agreement about what words mean. And this creates confusion, which is only helpful to people who are trying to maintain control. As I mentioned recently, if you keep people off balance, it's easier to manipulate and control them. Putin and his ilk have been doing this for many years, and it's been successful. He is still in power. And Trump and his cronies are applying a very similar playbook here, where it doesn't matter what your eyes tell you. That's not reality. It doesn't matter what you think a word means. That's not true. This is what a word means. And ignore that old meaning of the word and just forget the past. Forget how things used to be. Just what's happening now. What we're doing. That's what's true. That's what's right. It's incredibly dishonest. And it is, again, incredibly corrosive to society. They want to pit groups of people against one another so that nobody realizes the actual threat, which is coming directly from the government currently. And, under any leader, there is a certain level of threat from the government and their control and their attempt to manipulate things and mostly through what they conceal. Oh, you can't talk about this, it's top secret. And then you find out decades later, oh, well, the CIA was dosing a bunch of people with LSD and driving them crazy. That actually turns out to be a real thing. And MK Ultra did a lot of damage to a lot of people, and that's why Freedom of Information Act is so important. Because even if we don't get the information until really way too late to help the victims, at the very least we can prove this is a pattern of behavior. And if it happens again, it's people are less often accused of being crazy if they can point to an example from the past and go, look, this has happened before. How can it be outrageous to suggest it's happening again? We have proof it's happened before. So, having a universal reality that we all exist in is important. And that's why the bubblification of society is so problematic. I mean, again, the example of this woman's death in Minnesota, immediately online, there were lots of different people expressing many different views of what had happened. And we're all looking at the same video. And even, I mean, the attempts were so desperate so quickly to try to adjust the narrative. Oh, well, yeah, from this angle it looks like they did something bad, but if you look at this angle, which is much farther away, and then they try to spin it immediately. And I'm very appreciative of, I think it was the Times who did a very clinical breakdown, clarifying what had happened, and really taking any debate out of it, to make it clear that regardless what a person tries to claim, the reality is she was driving away. She wasn't a threat to anyone, and they murdered her. And government officials, JD Vance is the most abhorrent example of just denying reality entirely. He's still claiming, I think as far as he's concerned, that ICE agent's still in the hospital, in traction or something, despite the fact that everyone saw him walking around after the event itself. He was fine. And it shocks me that guy actually, it sounds like he's based out of Minnesota. So he's shooting his neighbors. That's crazy. But it's a part of a wider pattern of behavior. And if we can't agree on what words mean, if we can't agree on the definition of a threat, then that's a very big problem, because you have one group of people saying something was justified and another group of people saying obviously it's not. So there is a lot of danger here, not only currently, but also moving forward, that we are going to be too confused to be able to know up from down, right from wrong. That is extremely problematic and extremely dangerous. And how do we function as a society if we can't come to agreement on these things? What if the next thing they decide is that red lights don't mean stop and green lights don't mean go? Well, that's going to cause a lot of accidents. And I mean, obviously, that's an oversimplified example, but that is really what we're looking at here. If we cannot all agree on what the truth is, what reality is, and we're not all existing in the same universal reality, then then the circumstances are created for extreme danger for everyone. Because one person can just, I mean, considering how many guns are available in this country to the public, if somebody decides they have a new definition of what a threat is, then suddenly nobody knows when they're safe or not. I mean, it used to be safe to knock on someone's door, but now people shoot through doors and say, well, that was a clear and present danger to me, despite the fact that there was a door in between them and whoever was on the other side of it. And it's actually being debated. This kind of thing, there should be no debate there. If there's a locked door between you and someone else, you're not in danger until they get through that door and over the threshold and are physically inside of your domicile. They're not a threat, but it's still being debated. I don't know why. And as these things, as established definitions of terms start to be redebated and recontextualized, then there's no solid ground beneath our feet. And we're all less safe as a result. And I was under the impression that the primary responsibility of public officials and the government generally was to keep us safe. And it seems now the opposite of that is what is happening. Established science is no longer established, apparently, despite the fact that the scientists involved, they're not changing their story. But politicians and lobbyists and interest groups of different kinds are changing narratives and are trying to recontextualize things and reopen debates that have been closed for decades or longer because it's in their best financial interest to do so. Behind all of this is an opportunity for profits, and all these people care about is money. That seems very clear. So, as we continue to try to understand what is happening in the world around us, the more disagreement there becomes, the more disagreement that arises from people's understanding of reality, the less safe we will all be. And that's very scary. I think for little kids today, I think it must be terrifying because they don't know what to hold on to at this point. I thankfully am old enough that I still have memories of a saner time when certain things were simply understood as being true and right and the universal reality. But as time goes by more and more, and social media is absolutely a primary factor in the decay of our shared reality because it's so much easier to enter a different bubble and just exist within that bubble. And algorithms encourage those bubbles because it's more profitable for the companies behind those algorithms if people get as amplified a message as possible because all they care about is keeping your eyeballs on their content so that they can steal more of your information, especially information about human behavior, which then allows them to more effectively manipulate. This is all terrible, terrible stuff for society. And we need to return to some sense of a shared reality because until we're all looking at the same thing and agreeing that it is the same thing, then there is no universal reality. And that just leads to people losing their minds, even more than they have already.
Hey, hey, hey. You know what it is. Flip it. Let's move.